bit different, more roundtable and discussion after Dr. Elshtain's remarks, and trying to bring you all in on some of the questions as well in the discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to the moderator for tonight's panel, Dr. Douglas Hicks, who's on the faculty of the Jepson School and has his own very strong interest in this topic that we're talking about. So Doug, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good evening. We're all very privileged tonight to welcome to the Jepson School and the University of Richmond four leading authorities on morality and religion in public life, and it's a privilege to be here for me as well. This is a really fitting finale to what's been a great year, from Senators Dole and McGovern to scholars like Leon Cass and Michael Sandel. It's just been a really wonderful series looking at the state of public debate, and we've got a treat in store for you tonight, I hope. We've arranged this event as a roundtable discussion, or at least a half roundtable discussion. Dr. Elshtain will provide an opening talk, an opening presentation to set the key issues before us on morality, religion, and the state of public debate. Then each of the three panelists will make brief remarks in reply to Dr. Elshtain and on the general topic. Then we should have ample time for discussions amongst ourselves. University of Richmond students have provided me with a few questions on the topic that I would like to pose to the panelists. We're also going to give you all the opportunity to please write a few good questions for us to pose to the panelists here at the round table. My colleague Thad Williamson will help sort the questions and bring them forward, and I'll be posing the questions to this august group, and we should have a lively discussion. Now, so those of you students who sometimes come to events and slip out after the main presentation, I beg you to stay. I think the roundtable will be wonderful. I know American Idol is going to name a few finalists tonight, and Sasha is skating, but because of that, I don't want to provide a disincentive to you, so I'm just going to tell you who won the Olympic figure skating. No, I won't.
You don't know, do you?
I actually don't know.
All right.
But somebody knows.
Yeah.
So let me now introduce the participants. More information about them has been provided to you in the handout, so I won't give them the lengthy introductions that they certainly deserve. Let me start with the respondents in the order I'd like them to please respond after Dr. Elshtain. Dr. Michael Battle is, to my left, is Associate Professor of Theology and Associate Dean and Vice President of the Virginia Theological Seminary up in Alexandria. He obtained his PhD from Duke University in Theology and Ethics. His wide-ranging scholarship on the spiritual life, peacemaking, and Christian theology, Black church studies, are reflected in his books, including Blessed Are the Peacemakers and Reconciliation, the Ubuntu Theology of Desmond Tutu, among others. An Episcopal priest, Dr. Battle has studied and lived in the residence with Archbishop Tutu in Cape Town. Not many people can claim to have had the title personal chaplain to the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, but Michael Battle is such a person and is a gifted scholar and speaker. To my far right is Dr. Shaun Casey, who is Assistant Professor of Christian Ethics at the Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington. Dr. Casey's PhD is from Harvard Divinity School, and it prepared him to become a leading commentator on politics and religion. Just not so many months ago, I woke up to hear Shaun's voice on National Public Radio commenting on the role of religion in the 2004 presidential election. He also is active in Religion and Ethics Weekly and is often heard there as well. He works on religion and international affairs along with politics and religion in the U.S., works some on war and peace issues. He shares his insights with seminarians from around the country as he works with the seminarians in Washington program of Wesley Theological Seminary and helps them understand religion and politics, and he'll help us to understand that as well. Finally, on my left here is Dr. G. Scott Davis, the Lewis Booker Chair in Religion and Ethics and Chair of the Religion Department here at the University of Richmond. He earned his PhD in religion from Princeton University, and he holds prominence in the field of Christian ethics, particularly for his distinctive approach to questions of war and peace coming from a virtue ethics perspective. He's a broad-ranging intellectual who fits debates of religion and morality into historical, intellectual, and political context. He's never shy about sharing his well-thought-out views, articulating them, and I know he'll be a great panelist. So let me then introduce our first and main presenter, Dr. Bethke Elshtain. She is a political philosopher who received her PhD from Brandeis University. She taught at UMass Amherst and then was the first woman to hold an endowed professorship at Vanderbilt University. She moved to the University of Chicago. She is now in 1995, and in the meantime has held visiting positions at Oberlin and Harvard and Yale. And she sits in the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professorship of Social and Political Ethics at Chicago. Her many books are ranging in scholarship. They range from her early work, Public Man, Private Woman, Women in Social and Political Thought, which is now a modern classic in political theory, to more recent, widely read books, such as Democracy on Trial and Just War Against Terror, The Burden of American Power in a Violent World. These books have helped shape our public debate on very important issues. She's had numerous awards and fellowships for her work, too numerous to mention, but I would mention that she recently delivered the 6 Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh. And this is really a culminating honor for her, although I've said, we're glad she had that warm-up act in Edinburgh and could come to the Jepson School of Leadership Studies now. But she's a strong and thoughtful voice on the topics of this year's forum, and we're just honored to have her here. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists. First, Dr. Bethke Elshtain.
Well, thank you very much. I am going to offer up some preliminary comments and look forward to the discussion with my colleagues on the dais here and to your questions and comments. In a 1995 book just mentioned called Democracy on Trial, I argued that in a democracy we do politics with opponents, that enemies are the people that we fight against in a time of war. So we should think of those with whom we are engaged in the political sphere as our opponents and not as enemies that we intend or hope to somehow wipe out. So that's for starters. I want further to stipulate that our rules of engagement for democratic politics cannot be settled in an abstract way. That is, I don't think we can set up a whole list of criteria and say this defines the realm of appropriate civic discourse. It strikes me that we should be open to all kinds of arguments coming from all kinds of sites and places, with very few exceptions. I mean, there are some forms of speech, maybe we'll get to that, that have as their explicit aim the destruction, not just heaping contempt on others, but their actual physical destruction, that I think we would be advised to try to limit in some way, certainly not to see as legitimate political speech, but that's a whole other debate. We probably don't want to go there, as they say. What I want to do is to talk about the entanglement of religion with American political life for a few minutes. This will be my first theme. Here I think the salient question is not whether religion is involved with American political life, but how it is involved, how it has been involved historically, how it is involved currently. To the surprise of many of our Western European neighbors, Americans still do God talk. That's not the way they talk in Europe anymore. It's a post-Christian culture. But in the United States, rights talk, God talk, those are both ways that we talk in American civic life. And you will really not be able to understand American civic life if you try to sever it from this complex interplay, historically and currently, of America's religions, and most importantly, historically, this has meant Protestant Christianity. although that's of course been expanded to incorporate first Jews and Catholics, and then more recently other sorts of religious orientations. So the American project from its beginning was premised on the enactment of projects that were a complex intermingling then of religious and political imperatives. Church and state obviously are kept separate. We don't need to be told that. Ours has never been a theocratic nation. We've never had an official civic religion, but religion and politics have always been involved with one another. And this involvement of religion and politics is obviously not the same thing as the separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is a juridical construct. We do not have, and again, an official state religion, but this tells us nothing about the role that religion plays in American civil society, which has always been considerable. Now, in our democracy, in other words, we have assumed historically that one could be a believer and a citizen, that one could be a member of one's church and also a citizen of the state, of the polity. And the terrain in which these meet most of the time, believer, citizen, is in that realm of associational life that we call civil society. The person most associated with the discussion of American civil society is the great Alexis de Tocqueville in his classic work on democracy in America, where Tocqueville noticed, observed, and it struck him as something new under the sun, as he put it, the vibrancy of associational life in the United States, the way in which what we call voluntary associations kept springing up. And if there was a particular issue or a concern, Americans rushed to do something about it. And at the heart of American civil society, according to Tocqueville, lay America's churches. Those were really the central institutions, if you will, of civic formation. So we have church state on the one hand then, and this far more fluid, if you will, and complex and nuanced world of religion and politics. So what does this mean, having said that? What's involved? Well, first it means that the religious convictions of persons cannot be severed from their daily lives. It's not as if you're a religious believer, for a half on Sunday and then you cease to be the rest of the week, but that religious convictions enter into the way people think about who they are and conduct themselves. Whether they're in business or law or medicine or any other area of life, and people should not be required to divorce their faith from the way in which they live those lives and conduct themselves in their professions. So that's one point. The second is that many religious communities have a very rich tradition of constructive social engagement, and our nation has benefited from their work in such varied areas as social justice and civil rights and ethics. We can think of the role of the Black Baptist churches in the civil rights movement. We can think of the role of the Catholic Church historically in the early labor movement, the formation of labor unions in the United States. And we can continue to proliferate examples of this constructive social engagement. So these assumptions, these claims with which I'm beginning then, suggest a certain logic for engagement of religion in the civil realm. Clashes, what I'm saying, clashes with some modes of argumentation in American philosophy and in jurisprudence. There's one, and I'm not going to get all philosophical on you tonight, but I just want to mention that there's one dominant strand of philosophy very importantly debated in the American Academy. Don't think it has a whole lot of effect on the way people do things politically, but this argument is that basically that when persons of religious convictions enter into civic debate, political life, they are obliged to somehow translate all of those convictions into a kind of neutral civic idiom of public reason. Now, I, for one, have no idea what that means, what that is. And I don't even know what politics would be about if you tried to do that, other than perhaps a philosophy meeting. But there is that kind of argument. You are not permitted to bring religiously derived understandings and religious perspectives into the public arena explicitly as a philosophic position. And then there's another position that one might call strict separationism in jurisprudence. Again, it has not been the dominant strand of American jurisprudence, although it is a strand that has popped up from time to time, been more dominant at some points than others. And this strand basically holds that public life should be stripped of all religious symbols and signs and markers and even speech. That religion is essentially an entirely private matter and should not be publicly manifest nor displayed in any way. That the notion of public religion is in a sense oxymoronic. So it would follow, if you went that strict separationist route and believed you could achieve this bright line between religion and politics, not just church and state, although what tends to happen with the strict separationists is they take the logic of church-state separation and map it onto religion and politics. It would follow from that Christians, Jews, Muslims, anyone with a faith commitment is not permitted, if you will, to make that commitment manifest meaningfully in public life, in and through his or her involvement in an institution of the synagogue, the church, the temple, the mosque, and so on. Now, if you refract from those kinds of concerns, that is, if you look at those kinds of issues and you think about them from the standpoint of religious belief, the problem starts to look a lot different. It's not so much how much of this can the state tolerate or permit, but it goes more like this. What becomes evident is a problem from the religious point of view with narrowing the purview of politics, circumscribing the range of political debate, rather than opening it up, as I've argued, we should, and we ought to continue to do. So it's religion, if you will, that's put on the defensive quite consistently in many of these arguments, in jurisprudence and in philosophic arguments in the academy. Now, in a book some of you may know by Stephen Carter, the constitutional scholar from Yale, a book called The Descent of the Governed, Carter reminds us that tolerance is not simply a willingness to listen to what others have to say, although there are a lot of people who aren't prepared to do even that nowadays, but it's also a resistance, he tells us, and let me quote him here, to the quick use of state power to force dissenters and the different to conform. Right? And one example that that Professor Carter gives of this is pro-life protest and the ways in which attempts to quash this form of public advocacy proceeded apace with the blessings of the courts in applying RICO racketeering statutes that were originally designed to deal with organized crime to pro-life protest in order to limit that form and quash that form of dissent. So that's one of his big examples of the way in which this kind of jurisprudence can work to undermine American pluralism and the openness and complexity of our civic debates. Now, in this longer text, I go back to John Locke and the whole logic of religious toleration in the West. And let me just say, in the interest of time, that I think part of the problem, if you will, the debate we continue to have about these issues lies in some of the original rationale for religious tolerance. Because in this great essay on tolerance, John Locke separated what he called statescraft from soulcraft. And basically he argues that the world of soulcraft is essentially entirely a matter of private conscience. Entirely private. And soulcraft takes up the whole sphere of what constitutes the public. So a strong public presence and witness for religion, no, but private freedom of conscience, that's fine. Michael McConnell, in Locke's view. Michael McConnell, who's one of our leading scholars on the Free Exercise Clause, argues that if religious freedom means nothing more than that religion should be free as long as it is entirely irrelevant to public life, then it clearly doesn't mean very much, because you can't have, again, the public representation of faith in those ways. And that pushes, again, against a kind of plural public sphere in favor of one that's sanitized of certain kinds of debates and concerns. All right, that's the first part of what I have to say. The second part, and again, I'm very aware of the time, I want to just lay out four different modalities, if you will, four different ways that I've discerned that religious believers engage the public square, have historically and do currently. And let me list the four for you, and then I'll describe each of them very briefly. I call each of these respectively, number one, I didn't know a better way to describe it, full-bore Christian politics. That's the first option. Number two, prophetic witness. Number three, radical dualism. And number four, contextual engagement. Now let me go over each of these very briefly. Full-bore Christian politics is, in my view, the argument that the fullness of religious belief and commitment and witness must enter the public sphere, and precisely on religious terms. This has nothing to do with the legal establishment of religion, but it has to do with the conviction that religion is undermined if people with religious convictions engage in any translation, any attempt to translate those convictions into a civic language. So, in other words, you go forward and you cite scripture if need be and so on, and put it all out on every single point. So I've called this full-bore Christian politics, the view that this is not only appropriate but may even be necessary on nearly every issue. Now, a second position, prophetic witness. At first glance, it may look a bit similar to full-bore Christian politics, but this stance is quite different. Within this frame, no one pushes for a kind of undiluted Christian politics, nor seeks, and I would stay with the Christian example since that's our dominant tradition, seeks Christian saturation of ordinary, everyday political action, but rather persons religious respond to extraordinary situations from the fullness of religious conviction, where, and here one thinks first and foremost in our own time of Dr. King, of Martin Luther King, and his great speeches, which were also, of course, sermons. Stephen Carter has reminded us of that too. Says, you know, it's strange the way so many people have kind of talk about King as if he weren't a Baptist preacher. But these were sermons, these interventions. And he spoke insistently and consistently in biblical language, very powerfully, evoking scripture and evoking the Constitution, putting it all together in powerful rhetoric. It would be an act of the most severe restraint on speech to require of Dr. King retroactively that he drop all the religious references in his speeches. Then you wouldn't have Dr. King. You wouldn't have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, for heaven's sakes, and all the rest. His great speech, his I Have a Dream speech, the cadences, the specific references, basic text really from the prophet Amos. Do we have the audacity to say that that's unacceptable civic speech? I don't think so. I certainly don't. So prophetic witness. And I think in order to be prophetic witness, it has to be on occasions of deep and systematic and egregious sorts of flaws in the body politic. You can't offer prophetic witness every day on everything and have it really be prophetic witness. So full-bore Christian politics, prophetic witness. The third position I call radical dualism. In this particular position, the in response to the separationist argument, that people with religious convictions have to clean up their speech to go public. I think there's a sort of reaction to that says, in effect, if that's the way you want it, we're going to retreat into our own enclave and live in our lives as faithful Christians, and the public world can go to hell, because it's likely what it's going to do anyway. Now, in this view, citizenship, membership in a polity is downgraded, can even be considered potentially idolatrous, because it invites loyalty to something in addition to church. So again, I call this radical dualism, and I see it as a kind of negative mirror image both of the separationist position and, in a sense, of the full-bore Christian politics that wants Christian saturation of political life. So you have a kind of saturation of political life and a withdrawal. Finally, the fourth position, am I okay on time?
Sure.
How am I doing? All right. And it's my preferred alternative, is a position I called contextual engagement. And this is a position that calls upon citizens who are also religious believers to offer up a nuanced assessment of the ways in which religion enters civic life, depending on the nature of the issues involved. That is, we have to ask, what are the stakes here? And we also have to look at what arenas or spheres of social existence are affected. Does this have to do with the most vulnerable members of the society? Is this, as in the great Catholic tradition of social engagement, is this a common good issue? What sort of question is this? Who are the key players? Who's going to be affected, how, and why? How should those implicated in this situation address these issues in a way that they think can most effectively appeal to their fellow citizens who may not be believers at all? How can one be persuasive in a way that draws people to your concerns, a way that is more inclusive rather than exclusive? My working assumption is that in a pluralistic society such as our own, with its politics of modulation and negotiation and compromise, that most often, not all the time, but most often, the engagement of religious believers with politics is not going to be an earth-shattering dilemma. That is, the lines aren't going to be drawn in the sand. There are some issues where the lines do get drawn in the sand, where the religious believer says, this line shall not be crossed. Something has to be done about this. That was the case in civil rights, certainly for our brothers and sisters involved in the abortion debate. That's an issue because for them it concerns most vulnerable members of the society. And this is an issue then of the utmost urgency as far as they're concerned. So most of the time it seems to me that Christians as citizens, Jews as citizens, Muslims as citizens, everyone else, is obliged to participate in the discourse, to continue the argument, to try to find some way to find some common ground with those who do not share your explicit faith commitment. And saying this, I understand that there are some issues like euthanasia, abortion, capital punishment, some others, where you're going to go all the way down perhaps in your reason giving. That is, it might come to the point, where you say, because I believe human beings are created in the image of God, and this cannot be permitted, right? But many other issues, you don't have to go all the way down. You can stop and start at some other place, if you will. And certainly one can talk about the dignity of the human person without specifically evoking a religious tradition. But if pressed, one might go to the point that I just described. Let me make a couple of other quick points, and then I want to cease and desist and open it up for conversation. And that is that I think religious leaders make a mistake when they assume that you have a kind of moral mandate, a religious conviction, and then there's a public policy that's just attached to it with super glue. It doesn't work like that most of the time. that it's very difficult often to figure out the connection between a strong religious conviction and a public policy. I mean, when you're dealing with political policy, my own training is in fact in political science, when you're dealing with those sorts of issues, you understand the essential undecidability of certain things. That is, you cannot foretell all of the consequences. You're dealing with all kinds of contingencies. You can begin a policy, like let's say certain aspects of welfare policy, with certain good intentions, and then they have these devastating unintended consequences on African American family life and so on. So these are issues that are enormously murky and complex, and I think that one shouldn't try to make them too absolutely clear. There are some that are. You know, you either have de jure segregation or you don't. Now, what happens when you end de jure segregation? Things get murkier. You know, what kinds of public policies and so on, how can you best achieve social justice? But there's a wrong here that must be righted. That's clear. Then, from that point on, it gets a lot more complicated. So, it strikes me that, as with all Americans, persons of religious conviction, as citizens, bring all of who they are. You don't leave bits and pieces of yourself behind into the political arena. It is also important to think of how one can be most persuasive, because after all, politics is about persuasion, about trying to get a workable consensus on a particular issue. And I think also that religious believers are absolutely obliged and indeed entitled to ask the question, what sort of politics does religion require in order to play a role that religious commitments demand? That, again, too often, the question comes from the other side. How much should the state tolerate? I was in a debate with the Chief Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court about 2 years ago, commenting on a talk that she gave, and her entire argument was exactly that. How much can the state afford to accommodate? And there was a whole philosophy undergirding that I don't think she quite appreciated, and that needed to be pointed out, and that you could quite legitimately refract that question in another way. That is, I don't think she saw the kind of radical excisions that her opening assumption required or demanded by way of censoring and limiting religious witness and involvement in the public arena. Well, I have probably said enough, and I'm sure I'm up against my time limit. So let me conclude in this way. It strikes me that the demand that persons with religious convictions somehow demur from ever bringing those concerns into public life is excessively burdensome, places an undue burden on over 90% of the American population, if we trust the data, since that many people claim that they have a religious belief of some kind or another. People should not be thus obliged. We should not make those kinds of demands. A second final point, and that is that religious believers from their side are obliged to remember that the realm of political life is political, not religious, that you enter it as a citizen. You may be a citizen with religious convictions, but you're a citizen. And as a citizen, you are obligated to try to reach commonalities with other citizens who may not share fully your own religious convictions. And all of it, hopefully, in the interest of coming to know some good in common that, in fact, we cannot know alone. Thank you.
Let me remind you to go ahead and fill out your questions as you're hearing the comments from the panelists. And I know there's a student who will help. If you have a question and you don't have a card, please put your hand up to get a card. Dr. Bell.
I want to thank Dr. Elshtain for her wonderful insights. Just briefly, my my response. I'm really interested in your 4 modalities, and wondering, especially in your opening remarks, of how these 4 modalities work with the particularity of being religious in America. Because it seems to me that there are certain groups that can live within all 4, the full board model, the prophetic model, the radical dualism, and the contextual model. But for example, it would seem to me that the black church could live in all of those models, or those of immigrant status could live in all of those models. But it seems to me that in the American context, those who could live in all 4 of those models as opposed to choosing one of them would carry a oppressed identity in some way or another. It reminds me of the black church in a sense, that the black church doesn't get much credit for its creativity of being religious and yet sort of spawning the civil rights movement at the same time. And also, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about my own narrative, which is a complex one, a black Episcopalian. Talking about oxymorons. Thinking about how such an identity works. And yet, if I don't have a larger reference point, I couldn't make sense of such an identity. Meaning, if I wasn't familiar with the fact that there are more black Anglicans than there are black National Baptists, then I wouldn't be able to make sense of that. So the reference point of American religion is very helpful to know that, a fish doesn't know it's wet. For us to know that we are a particular kind of community trying to be religious is and political, is very important. I think that the second thing, this joke will help me try to make the second point. There are 3 reasons why Jesus was black. 1, he always called people brother. 2, he liked gospel. And 3, he could never get a fair trial. It works in better in other contexts, this joke does. The context of being religious in the political landscape of America, it seems to me that unless you have a particularity of being religious and political, you wouldn't be intelligible. So for example, unless you were a black church, or unless you were a Korean Presbyterian church, the very religious identity in America is political, it seems to me. And I think that's also probably peculiarly American. And I would make some arguments that we really need to do a lot more work in terms of how many Christianities do we have in America. Being an Episcopalian, we're on the verge of schism because of the culture wars going on over having an openly gay bishop. The particularities of our own denomination are really understood in political ways. So I guess the second point I'm trying to make is that to what extent really being religious in America is also political. And I think you're making that point. I just would love to hear you talk about that explicitly. But those are the 2 kinds of responses I have to you. That it seems to me that first, that oppressed groups could live in all four modalities? And then secondly, to what extent is the very religious identity based on America's history de facto political?
Dr. Casey.
Well, thank you, Dr. Elshtain. This is, we could go on all night. And I have three comments, and two of them track with things Michael said. As a theologian, and I guess I approach this issue from the theological perspective and less from the political side, although I think we meet in the middle, I would want to defend the proposition that theologically all four of these options are valid options for specific, particularly in my case, Christian communities in a democratic polity. Again, contextually, we would decide the appropriateness, I think, but I would want to defend all four theologically as being valid options under different circumstances. And I mean, I think theologically too, some of the left-wing heirs of Karl Barth may be the most fulsome theological sources to go to defend that proposition. And depending on how esoteric we want to get tonight, we might jump into some of that. But secondly, I'm intrigued by concrete religious communities today that are trying to navigate this divide. And I want to list four very quickly that are live issues today. Perhaps the most intriguing movement in Christianity today by my lights is the emergent church movement, sort of a post-evangelical explosion that's going on. And at the heart of that is an open question: what is the public role of the church? And that question is being negotiated now in churches all across the country, and it's just a vigorous theological discussion going on. And the outcome of that question, what the public role of the emergent church is going to be, potentially offers fascinating dividends in our society. Secondly, the Democratic Party is learning religion. One need not go any further than the gubernatorial race we had here in Virginia to see a progressive, devout Catholic embrace his religion and reach out to diverse religious communities in a way the Democrats historically have not done in recent memory. And I think the reverberations of that shockwave are going through the entire party. It's going to be fascinating to see how that narrative plays out. Thirdly, the debate over the war, I argue, is a theologically driven grassroots movement that as America has now turned against the Iraq War, the church has played, if not the leading role, a leading role in that public opinion turn, and that's worth parsing. And the last one, which is really, I think, under a lot of people's radar, is maybe the most interesting grassroots social movement in America today, the living wage movement, which was actually born in an interfaith clergy group in Baltimore. That was the first civic ballot option where a metropolitan area embraced the living wage, and it was clergy-driven at the grassroots
Yeah, well,
level.
it was IAF, Industrial Areas.
They played a tiny role in that. It was born in the clergy group, and then they partnered with IAF. But that's happening all across the country, and it's interesting to see the role that religion plays there.
Which it goes back to Catholic social thought, the living wage, to Monsignor
John
Ryan.
That's right. But what's interesting is the Baltimore group, and in most of these groups, they're not exclusively Catholic.
Right.
I mean, it's really a multi-layered kind of group. Then the last thing I want to talk about are the threats to religious groups as they enter the public sphere, and I would love to hear your reactions. Part of my hesitancy is that sometimes politicians take an instrumental view of religion. Where are the votes that I can reap from partnering? And you get co-optation, you get manipulation, you get coercion. Stephen Carter's argument is, by definition, that politics is the art of compromise. That is a threat to Christian integrity and authenticity. And I'd be curious to hear your response. And I guess lastly, I hear a little bit of the trace of the liberal position you critique at first when you say religious folk need to remember they enter the public policy sphere as citizens first. I know a lot of Christians for whom that's not, in fact, their identity. That sometimes, for instance, pro-life, they feel like they're dragged kicking and screaming in the public sphere. They'd rather not be there. They're dualists.
And that they're not wanted there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in fact, they don't want to be there, except that they feel so driven that they're not going to accept that. If the entrance ticket is, I've got to accept, I'm entering as a citizen first, not as a Christian, they're going to feel the same kind of coercion you feel from liberals who say you've got to completely denude the public sphere. I'm curious what you say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Davis?
Preparing for this event, I was trying to find something that might be contentious and interesting to say. But I realized that, at least in the broader sense of things, Jean Elshtain and I tend to agree. For example, that religion, ethics, and politics all lie within the recognized and reasonable ways of approaching questions about who we are and how we should live. Thus, I think we also agree that there are no legitimate grounds for excluding theological claims from the public square ab initio. Furthermore, unless there's a strong interpretation of something like the First Amendment to the Constitution, there's no good reason to prohibit enacting theological positions into law. Well, then what was I gonna say? And so this famous quote that's attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr kept popping into my mind, which usually goes, "The doctrine of original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian faith." Now, as it turns out, Niebuhr didn't say that, although he says things like it in his Gifford lectures, right? But if he had said it, and it's such a good line that, can scarcely resist, it would still be a religious claim specific to a particular religious view of human nature. As such, it differs in substance from the more modest but genuinely verifiable claim that Aristotelians like myself make, namely that sometimes some people do really bad things. Now, why should this difference matter? Well, Niebuhr, who is the preeminent public theologian of the 20th century in the United States, maintained a self-consciously Augustinian theology. And he's followed in this by Jean Elshtain, who has written eloquently on both Augustine and Niebuhr. In particular, she's invoked them both in Just War Against Terrorism to argue against the Aristotelian claim that the demands of justice trump the restraint of evil when such restraint fails to measure up to the demands of justice. Now, what's not clear to me, and perhaps this is because I have not yet read Who Are We?, is whether this rests on taking original sin and human fallenness as simple facts to be taken into account in any critical reflection on the possibilities before us. And the reason that it's important to answer that question is that invoking original sin as a fact of nature tends to depreciate the demands of justice, and thus, for us Aristotelians, it tends to corrupt public debate. Right? We democratic Aristotelians tend to be strong believers in freedom of speech. But in the movement from speech to policy, we're inclined to think that the burden of proof lies on the public authorities and their supporters to justify whatever proposals they may put forward, particularly when those proposals seem contrary to justice. If this justification is not forthcoming, then we're inclined to think any lesser grounds for action, be they secular utilitarian grounds or Christian theological reasons, are really excuses for allowing our fears to guide us down the path to injustice and to the social corruption that results when injustice becomes a habit. And so I pose this question about the status of original sin. See where that'll take us this evening.
Dr. Elshtain, would you like to respond to these three remarks, and then we'll move to questions?
Yeah, I'll do it very quickly. Thank you so much. These were all most interesting and very, very challenging. First, Dr. Battle, you're absolutely right that these four modalities should not be thought of as airtight compartments, but do in fact bleed into one another. And I think you're especially correct that those who have found their historic experience to be that of enforced exclusion from the wider civic arena would in fact find entirely appropriate at certain points that more defensive posture that I was calling radical dualism, that wouldn't be so much from choice as from necessity, but it then is a position out of which they can move. That is, they're not locked into it and are prepared to move out and to engage the public arena in all its aspects once conditions begin to change, in part through their own actions. On your, I think, far more difficult question about whether being religious is also being political de facto, there, in order to really have that discussion, you and I would have to sort out what we mean by political, what it means to be political, and we obviously can't do that right now. I would be inclined to be a little hesitant to make that claim, depending upon how one is understanding politics. Let me just say give two more sentences. If you think of politics as forms of rule, hopefully legitimate rule and authority over a sort of given territory that includes people who are not necessarily do not necessarily profess a single faith, in other words, politics and modernity, then I think that's rather different from thinking of politics as the particular ways in which groups understand themselves and form themselves and continue their own existence, which can also be certainly seen as a form of politics. So that we just have to sort that out. Dr. Casey, yeah, I agree with you that all four forms at different points could be valid. Again, clearly I worry if full-bore Christian politics is the only way that people have to engage at every point. Certainly on the issues that you mentioned, these really difficult, deep moral issues like abortion, one can fully understand those who take that particular stance. But as you know, there are also some who would take the solemnity of, if you will, of that kind of stance, sort of transfer it to a whole range of issues that aren't of the same gravity, I would say, and that seems to me a little more problematic. I'll pass over the emergent church movement for a moment, just acknowledge the force of what you had to say about that. On the Democratic Party learning religion, I suppose the issue would be the Democratic Party getting religion. I mean, I think that there's, in other words, I think that the issue, I have a hunch that voters can sift the difference between someone who's using religion instrumentally and someone who is bringing religion, religious conviction into public life. And I don't think that's the purview of any single party, clearly. And certainly at one point, when the Democratic Party was the party of immigrants and of as well as urban intellectuals and so on, you certainly had a strong base in the Catholic Church, for example, and so on. The abortion issue really broke up that, as you know, broke up that coalition. And I don't think it's going to be put back together anytime soon. So I actually have raised this question to some people, the whole question about Democrats needing to begin to learn religion. Well, you've got to get religion first, probably, if you're going to make those kinds of arguments in an authentic way and not just in an instrumental way. And that holds for everybody, but it's become, as you know, a specific issue within the Democratic Party at the moment. Now on your, the living wage already intervened about the long history of that, so we'll let that go. On the issue of theologically driven public policy, and the current war, I wish that a lot of the opposition were theologically driven in a complex way, but I think a lot of it isn't so complex. I mean, I think some of the statements coming out of some of the churches have seemed to me embarrassingly simplistic. That is, I think a simplistic theology leads to a simplistic politics. Now that's something that we'd have to debate further. Certainly the Catholic Church has a very rich tradition because of the natural law tradition, a way of debating, and the fact that it was the keeper of the just or justified war tradition historically, has a longer history of dealing with these things in a really complicated way. But certainly the mainline Protestant churches, I think the statements were embarrassingly vapid, I have to say, quite honestly. Theologically. The statements would be politically better if they were theologically stronger. Now, Scott, My goodness, I knew you'd do this to me. On the thesis, thank you. The thesis of original sin, it strikes me that it's not the moves I'm going to make here won't surprise you. I wouldn't want to affect as severe a line as you do between the recognition of human fallenness, which is what I would call original sin, and concerns with justice. I would say that the kind of stringency regarding fallen human nature, which is part of my Lutheran heritage, and this sort of Augustinian backdrop, I think is a very helpful corrective to overly benign and optimistic views about what might eventuate. But I do think that, so I don't want to separate justice from the restraint of evil. I mean, I think that, you know, these have to go together in a complex way. And as you know, my worry about Aristotelianism is I have no problem with virtue. My worry about Aristotelianism is that I don't think you have a sufficiently developed understanding of the weakness of the will. But that's something that we could debate.
Well, thank you all for those comments. And now I want to go to some questions, invite our student to work with Dr. Williamson to bring some questions forward. And I'll go ahead and ask some of the questions from my students and admittedly from me as well. First of all, we all tend to agree on the panel that religion and morality have an important place in public life and that it's worth contesting them. But I want to ask a question that even some of the, persons on both sides of the debates have, the claim they've made that to say that the discussions about such things as whether under God should remain in the Pledge of Allegiance or whether we should have in God we trust on our coins, are these distractions from the real issues of religion in public life, or is there something really at stake in these central symbolic statements or the language that we use?
I think someone else should start. I've been talking more than anyone, so.
I think the simple answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yes, what?
Yeah. It's a
Yes,
distraction.
please. It is
It's
a distraction.
Yeah.
And it keeps us
Yeah.
from, there's a professional sort of chattering class for
Yeah,
whom
yeah.
that is a set of interesting questions. I'm really not sure. I mean, if it were erased tomorrow, I would not be hurt. If it remains in our country's polity, I don't think there's excessive damage. They're much more vital questions, even on religious liberty kinds of questions and establishment questions that far overshadow the magnitude of those questions.
Yeah, I just want to, again, a couple of sentences. I agree, and it is interesting that the Supreme Court has indicated that you can kind of tolerate these sorts of things because they don't mean anything religiously anymore. Under God or in God we trust, it's just become, we're just used to it. And on those grounds it can be tolerated.
But there's something disturbing to me as a person of faith when that's the legal
Oh,
justification.
I agree.
for such
Oh,
things. Well, they're not really important, so we should just leave them.
I don't disagree with that at all. But I agree with Dr. Casey that I don't think this is not where the rubber hits the road. I mean, these are not the most important issues.
Coming from the other side, I suppose, of that question, I want to say I also agree that these are sort of pointless discussions until someone tries to use something like reciting the Pledge of Allegiance as a requirement for either teachers or students in the classroom. There, I think the legitimate symbolic gesture towards our religious past has become a religious test, and that's something that I think we ought to stand up against.
But I do think there's a dialectic here that the more you have those that Dr. Casey called the chattering classes trying to bring test cases and eliminate these things, the more likely you're to get that kind of reaction. So that's what kind of politics you get on the extreme edges, and it's most unfortunate.
And let me shift gears with another question. When we look at public life, whether it's the civil sphere, whether it's the workplace, whether it's public schools, we get the claim from a lot of Christians, particularly Christian evangelicals, that they're being discriminated against, that in a certain way they're disenfranchised or marginalized. Whereas critics of particularly strong presence of religion in public life will say that Christians, especially evangelicals, are actually in power, that they're empowered socially and culturally. So my question is, are evangelicals in a majority position or a minority position in public life?
You should take that, Shaun.
Then I'll go to you, Dr.
Why don't you go?
Yeah,
I answered first last
You
time.
too should take it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's learning from the Black tradition, from contextual theology. It's learning a rhetoric from those who are struggling from oppression in America, so they're trying to claim that identity. It doesn't work, though. It doesn't work in the sense that those who are evangelical are not aware of this, what W.E.B. Du Bois would call double consciousness. So they are in power, they are dominant, and yet they can still try to claim to be a minority, but it doesn't work. They cancel each other out. Whereas if you're evangelical and you're Black, it's unintelligible. So until we can try to figure out how these categories work for only one kind of people, well, I think that's what the white evangelical is going to have to figure out. Until they can figure out how evangelical and Black, evangelical and Korean, or whatever can work, then they won't have any ground to stand upon. So it becomes an unintelligible debate.
Dr. Casey, this is part of your tradition.
3 years ago, Religion and Ethics Newsweek, the PBS show, did the largest survey of evangelical attitudes ever done. And they discovered this double-mindedness. On the one hand, white evangelicals think they are mainstream Americans, that they are absolutely in the middle. Simultaneously, they feel like they are an excluded minority, or even majority in some cases. And so there is this double-mindedness, and you see the kind of the schizophrenia at times, where I think it's going to become really interesting. I look at my daughter's 6th grade classroom in the Northern Virginia public school. There are 31 kids, easily 10 nations of origin there, and 7 world religions represented. Now, how would you institutionalize formal prayer, clergy-led prayer in that school? And I think that increasingly it's becoming the American experience all across this country. It's not just a bi-coastal phenomenon. And I'm still hanging on by my fingernails in this evangelical tradition. They're ready to kick me out, but nevertheless, I know that
We won't let them.
Thank you. But there is a struggle with how do they express themselves, but then how do you do with the pushback? I think it's the pushback part that evangelicals have not worked out yet. I mean, how do you engage them with somebody who says, well, I'm sorry, I see it differently, my religion leads me to a different public policy. There's not a lot of history there. There's not a tradition to draw on for that kind of civic engagement. And they're still in a learning process, I think.
That makes a lot of sense to me, given the fact that evangelicals really went into hiding after the Scopes trial and so forth. I mean, just politically became invisible for a long time. And, and it takes a while for people precisely to work out the complicated give and take of all of these issues. But let me just add one other little piece here. It's not quite the question, but I think it bears on it. And that is that the environment in which I find myself at an elite institution is one in which the general view of evangelicals is one of scarcely concealed contempt, I think I could say. That these are folks who are not quite as knowledgeable and sophisticated as the rest of us, and so that's a very routine, very routinized sort of view of folks who are evangelical Christians, and I think it's most unfortunate. I mean, and it does factor into things like how you evaluate applications for graduate school, what schools they come from. Well, do we really trust these letters? I mean, after all, they're teaching at such and such, and it makes it harder to evaluate a student on his or her merits, because there are really bright, smart kids everywhere, going to colleges everywhere. So I think there is a kind of animus, certainly in many of our elite institutions, against evangelical Christians, black and white.
Thanks. We'll take a question from the audience. It says Dr. Elshtain, but I'll open it up to everyone. You cite de Tocqueville, who indeed said that religion is the foundation of a just democracy. But de Tocqueville also said that for religion to function effectively in this way, the institutional church and clergy should stay out of politics as much as possible. Otherwise, the church clergy will lose their religious influence on the people. Do you agree with de Tocqueville on this point?
Well, I wouldn't agree with the characterization of Tocqueville's position. I think that one needs to distinguish here between what one might call explicit political office and holding explicit political authority and the politics of civil society. And certainly there's a great example. Tocqueville attended basically a labor rally. I mean, it was a meeting where a Catholic priest was addressing this group, a beleaguered group, about social injustices based upon church teaching. For me, that's political. That's a political activity in a political context. The priest wasn't running for office. So I think that it depends on how expansive or narrow a view of politics one holds. So Tocqueville, I think, was very clear that America's churches are the heart of American civil society, and since civil society is where we do politics, it's not the official realm of rule and governance, but it's where we do politics. So I think he really did see the central, that clergy should not stay out. They're very much in that world.
But they should stay out of political office?
Well, I think, I would have to go back and reread. I don't think he spends a lot of time on that, but I have a hunch he would be wary of that, because that might start to inch more towards, too tight an alliance between throne and altar, if you will, of the sort that had characterized his own culture historically. It still wouldn't be the same as having an established church, but it might start to entangle things too tightly.
I believe he said it would undermine the religious authority of those religious figures because if the policy were discredited.
Sure.
Dr. Casey, you want to jump in as
Well,
well?
I mean, that's Stephen Carter's argument, that particularly electoral politics poses a unique threat in civil society because it ultimately will undermine the theological authenticity and legitimacy. I'm not sure I buy the argument. In Carter's form, it's automatic, it's inherent.
Right,
And I think that's too strongly posed.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. What do you think of political moral arguments being made by people who are stridently, that's the key word for this question, stridently beating their chests and claiming to be Christian, to be Jewish, to be Islamic, etc.? Since no person has totally perfect viewpoints, can't this stridency cast a pall on any or all religions?
Somebody else should pick this up.
Dr. Davis, I think you...
Well, gee, thanks, Doug. I'm not one of those people that find stridency troubling, surprisingly. I like to see arguments made vigorously and rebutted vigorously. I like to see people feel free to enter into the political realm with both the fervor of their conviction and also the willingness to distinguish politics from war. When we're doing political work, we're already committed at some point to saying, all right, I've lost, we'll have it you guys' way for the next period of time. As long as we're recognizing the legitimate disagreements that will also become legitimate compromises, we should be as strident as we feel we want to be. Not impolite necessarily, although I'm not terribly averse to that either, but that's another matter.
Yeah, stridency may not be the most effective politics, but I think that that stridency is obviously a very slippery term, and one person's vigorous debate might be another stridency. So again, I don't think that's something you could stipulate on in advance. Certainly when I was in Scotland for the 2 weeks delivering these lectures, was the moment when you started to get the furor around the cartoons in the Danish newspaper, and some of the debates, some of the protests in Trafalgar Square, I thought went way beyond the bounds of of politically acceptable argument. It wasn't argument; these were direct threats to murder people, and he who insults the prophet will be beheaded. He who insults the prophet must die. With big drawings of the Danish Prime Minister having his throat slit and blood spurting everywhere. That's way beyond stridency. So I think we can stipulate that's not the sort of thing that should appear in the public square from any angle. There should be ways that one can, that really is advocacy of incitement to direct violence. But ordinary, everyday garden variety stridency, I don't think is a big problem.
The question about Muhammad and the publication of the cartoons was a question.
Well,
pass on that. But jump in if you'd like.
Yeah, kind of said something about that already. So.
What role, if any, does gender play in civic leaders' communication of religious rhetoric? Dr. Elshtain, we'll start with you since you wrote a book on public man, private woman.
Say again, does gender play in civic leaders?
Use of religious rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a gender divide on that. What I would see is men and women speaking from their particular religious traditions. So let's say when Sister Helen Prejean speaks about capital punishment and the death penalty, she's articulating what is within the boundary of Catholic thought on the issue. So the way in which she talks about that is not significantly different from the way in which a priest would discuss it, or a strong Catholic bishop and so forth. There is one thing that I think I will add, however, that historically it's been very interesting that many women involved in civic life from a religious perspective embraced as part of their self-understanding and self-identity a kind of maternal image, that they're bringing a kind of motherly voice that carries religious conviction, kind of maternal voice into these political understandings and political discussions, and that's striking. That's one voice. There's been another voice, which is the voice of the sort of committed, non-maternal woman who, in a sense, has taken up a vocation. A Protestant vocation. She embodies the activist, the believer, who is denying herself a private life in order to be out in the civic arena in full force. So maybe on the level of certain identities, you're going to get some interesting differences. But I think generally men and women are going to reflect their specific traditions.
Let me disagree a little bit with that. I mean, I think if you take the test case of Hillary Clinton, for instance, which is just absolutely fascinating to me, that when she speaks on her faith, out of her faith, it is just summarily rejected across the board. There are very few people who take that as legitimate. And yet you can trace it in her public and personal narrative from infancy. Mm-hmm. And yet there's a refusal of right and left and middle to take that seriously. And maybe it's too large a thing to extrapolate from that to gender.
I wouldn't extrapolate from that to gender.
I think you've got the offended wife. Yeah. You've got the working mother. I mean, you've got a lot of different roles there. And the notion of a female political leader as a devout Christian is very, very complicated in our world today. And so I think that there's a role for gender in that, I think, if you look at that example.
Well, I'm not sure how much you could extrapolate from that particular example, in part because there's so much baggage associated with being Hillary Clinton and, Bill's wife and all the stuff that goes with that. So I'd have to think about that. I'd be hesitant to extrapolate from that particular case.
Well, if you look, I think two specifics. If you look at the Albany speech she gave on abortion, for instance, from right and left, that evoked a charge of illegitimacy and pandering. But if you look at her speech back in 1996,
I don't think that had to do with religious conviction, though. I think that had to do with people not wanting to have any kind of modulation of abortion politics.
No, I think her point in that speech was that we need to respect people who come at abortion out of their faith. I mean, that was an explicit part of the text, I think.
Well,
Dr. Bowden?
well, yeah, we
Yeah.
could continue this, yeah.
If I can sort of expand the concept of gender, if I can talk a little bit about expanding the concept of gender, at least in the Episcopal Church, if we're talking about the construction of sexual identity, it seems to me that that's a pivotal debate right now in terms of who should have power, who God rightfully ordains,
Who will be the next presiding bishop?
who will be the next presiding bishop. Will we stay together as a church?
Right.
Can we understand sexual identity in light of a person who is a lesbian? It seems to me if you're looking at gender in that kind of a way, that's very much shaping what the religious debate is. And not to say the problem of divorce, the problem of parenting. How is it that we understand our sexual identities in light of these public constructions? It seems to me that's the heart of what is going on.
Okay, here's another question. Dr. Elshtain, if you'd start, and then we'll open it up. Dr. Elshtain, I believed I heard you say something along the lines of religious believers frequently making a mistake when they feel a moral mandate to take certain positions on policies. Do supposedly pro-life and opposition to gay marriage justices make mistakes when they allow their feelings to affect their judgments on the Supreme Court, or the way they rule because they feel some moral mandate?
Well, first of all, I think the questioner somewhat misunderstood what I said. What I said was not that people make a mistake when they bring moral mandates into political and civic life, but that it is a mistake to assume that there's a clear public policy attached to a moral mandate, that often the connection between a moral mandate and a public policy is very complicated. You don't have a one-on-one kind of translation. So that's quite a different thing from what the questioner assumes that I said. And I'll just stick with what I said. But that said, let me say that there's an assumption in the questioner's question that I want to raise a challenge to, and that is the notion of feelings. Should their feelings affect what they have to say? And this really bespeaks an indebtedness to philosophy called emotivism, which holds that our complex moral understandings are reducible to emotions that have no cognitive content. So in other words, when I react to something, I have emotion, and that's not rational. So there's no reason involved. And that emotivist position then reduces all strong statements of value to just subjective emotional reactions. And I think that is, I think that's wrong. It's a very, very common mistake, and it's one that is often tacitly taught by people who don't quite know the whole philosophic backdrop of this emotivist argument. So if a justice, let's say, made an argument on a case that came forward having to do with Roe, and articulated through the use of reason, through the use of American jurisprudential history, through the use of case law and all the rest, a view that there can or should be certain restraints on the American abortion regime, which is the most unregulated in the world, the most liberal in the world. He's not just throwing his emotions in. I mean, there's a reasoned argument in there. So I would be very wary of saying, well, don't let your feelings enter into it. You know, when we react to something, let's say with horror, we may have an initial reaction of horror when we see, you know, images of death camps and so on. There's a very complex understanding behind that expression of horror. It's not just a feeling without rational content. So one has to be very careful about that.
Now, I want to agree with that rather strongly. I think that the idea that somehow ethical positions are to be identified with
Yeah.
feelings is one of the ways in which I'm going to have to say, despite my deep affection for the 1960s, that the 1960s has corrupted contemporary political debate, because feelings, ideas, beliefs, and hopes are all part of our larger moral perspective on the world. And if they lack any cognitive content, if you have those feelings without the beliefs, the expectations, and the hopes, then you're just going to be running amok. And that's not good for politics.
I want to ask one more question that is germane to tonight's discussion that hasn't come up explicitly yet. And that is, we're in a city, mid-sized American city, with a very large and significant Islamic community, one of the most beautiful Islamic centers in the country, right here just across the river. And the question is, so Islam is not just a foreign religion, although it's often portrayed that way in the media. The question is, in American public life, do we know how to talk about Islam? And does the increasing significance in public life of Islam and Muslims in our own society change any of the contours of religion in public life now and into the future?
Who do you want to start?
Well, let me start on that just because I'm currently teaching a course on the moral world of the Crusades. And one of the things that you pretty much have to do in teaching a course with that title is to introduce Islam to a class full of people amongst whom there are few, if any, Muslims.
Yeah.
And these people are astounded at the connections of Islam to Christianity and Judaism, the way in which some Muslims perceive themselves as the precursors of democratic society, the ways in which religion and political language are so closely intertwined that it's not easy to separate them the way that we do, particularly in liberal 21st century America. So I think that it's really incumbent upon the Academy, perhaps more than anybody else, to continue to teach Islam to as many students as we can, frankly.
Let me, I just want to add to that, to what Scott has said, that Islam is many things, it's not one thing. And there's a debate going in within Islam. It's a very important one, obviously. People who are trying to, Muslims who are trying to counter radical Islamism and that deadly ideology. So I think the first way to start thinking about Islam is not to equate Islam to the Islamists, to the radical Islamists, and then to go on from there to begin to nuance one's own understanding. All of that said, I think, Scott, if I understood you correctly, it is a challenge, I think, within Islam to deal precisely with the kind of strong pluralistic ideas, given the close welding together historically of the religious and the political in the Islamic tradition, which has lent itself to theocracy more readily than the Christian tradition, certainly. So that's a challenge. But I think that as with every other religious community that's journeyed to American shores, you're going to have Islam being, you'll have an American Muslim approach or a tendency, I suspect, over time.
I think the tragedy of America's misunderstanding of Islam, and I agree with everything you've said. I mean, American soldiers are dying today because of a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of Islam in the world today. The neoconservative position that somehow underlying all of these particular expressions of Muslim faith was the sort of nascent Tom Paine, Thomas Jefferson view that people would embrace Western liberal freedom and democracy instead of, or in addition to, or in priority to their Muslim faith, was a fundamental mistake. That we went to war believing that, as part of our going to war, that we were going to liberate these people, we'd be welcomed as liberators because they yearned for the kind of Western democratic freedom that we express. And so far the case is overwhelmingly against that. And I think it goes to the misunderstanding of Islam across our culture, but certainly in the upper echelons of our government too.
You want me to say?
Go ahead. I think we've got a little more energy here, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm not going to, I have a lot more to say on that particular issue where I don't disagree completely, but I would disagree in part. But I'm just going to have to tantalize you with what that disagreement would be. That I've been asked to round things up, and I just want to, first of all, reiterate my gratitude of being invited to participate in this with so many good colleagues and get reacquainted with old friends like Ken Ruscio is out there somewhere. And also, I think you can see from the richness of, of what my colleagues have said and from the complexity of your questions just how difficult and how engaging these issues really are, and that they really go to the heart of the matter of who we are as a people, and what our future political and civic landscape will look like. So thank you all very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. As this is the last event in the Jepson Forum, I would be remiss not to thank Sue Robinson and her staff
Yes,
at the
absolutely.
Jepson School
Sue,
for
I
such
should
a
have
wonderful
done, yeah.
series. And I want to thank Dr. Davis, Dr. Casey, and especially Dr. Elshtain for being. This is really a wonderful, high-caliber panel. What a great way to end the discussion this year, and it shows we've got a lot of talking yet to do. So thank you all for being here, for your questions, and good evening.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you. Great job. Thank you.